This is another story that I love from Junior Classics, and it's called A Chinese Fairy Tale. Tiki-pu was a small grub of a thing, but he had a true love of art deep down in his soul. There it hung, mewing and complaining, struggling to work its way out of the raw exterior that bound it. Tiki-pu's master professed to be an artist. He had apprentices and students who came daily to work under him in a large studio littered about with the performance of himself and his pupils. On the walls hung a few real works by older men, all long dead. This studio Tiki-pu swept. For those who worked in it, ground colors, washed brushes, and ran errands, bringing them their food from the nearest eating house whenever they were too busy to go out and get it themselves. He himself had to feed mainly on the breadcrumbs which the students screwed into pellets for their drawings and then threw upon the floor. It was on the floor also that he had to sleep at night. Tiki-pu looked after the blinds and mended the paper window panes, which were often broken when the apprentices threw their brushes and mahl sticks at him. Also he strained rice paper over the linen stretchers, ready for the painters to work on, and for a treat now and then, a lazy one would allow him to mix a color for him. Then it was that Tiki-pu's soul came down into his fingertips, and his heart beat so that he gasped for joy. Oh, the yellows and the greens and the lakes and the cobalts and the purples, which sprang from the blending of them. Sometimes it was all he could do to keep himself from crying out. Tiki-pu, while he squatted and ground at the color powders, would listen to his master lecturing the students. He knew by heart the names of all the painters in their schools, and the names of the great leader of them all who had lived and passed from their midst more than 300 years ago. He knew that, too, a name like the sound of the wind, Wio-wani. The big picture at the end of the studio was by him. That picture, to Tiki-pu it seemed worth all the rest of the world put together. He knew, too, the story that was told of it, making it as holy to his eyes as the tombs of his own ancestors. The apprentices joked over it, calling it Wio-wani's back door, Wio-wani's nightcap, and many other nicknames. But Tiki-pu was quite sure, since the picture was so beautiful, that the story must be true. Wio-wani, at the end of his long life, had painted it, a garden full of trees and sunlight, with high-standing flowers and green paths, and in their midst was a palace. The place where I would like to rest, said Wio-wani, when it was finished. So beautiful was it then that the emperor himself had come to see it, and gazing enviously at those peaceful walks and the palace nestled among the trees, he sighed and owned that he, too, would be glad of such a resting place. Then Wio-wani stepped into the picture and walked away along a path until he came, looking quite small and far off, to a low door in the palace wall. Opening it, he turned and beckoned to the emperor, but the emperor did not follow, so Wio-wani went in by himself and shut the door between himself and the world forever. That happened 300 years ago, but for Tiki-pu the story was as fresh and true as if it had happened yesterday. When he was left to himself in the studio, all alone and locked up for the night, Tiki-pu used to go and stare at the picture until it was too dark to see, and at the little palace with the door in its wall by which Wio-wani had disappeared out of life. Then his soul would go down into his fingertips, and he would knock softly and fearfully at the beautifully painted door, saying, "Wio-wani, are you there?" Little by little, in the long, thinking nights and the slow, early mornings when light began to creep back through the papered windows of the studio, Tiki-pu's soul had become too much for him. He who could strain paper and grind colors and wash brushes had everything within reach for becoming an artist, if it was the will of fate he should become one. He began timidly at first, but in a little while he grew bold. With the first wash of light, he was up from his couch on the hard floor, and was daubing his soul out on the scraps and odds and ends and stolen pieces of rice paper. Before long, the short spell of daylight which lay between dawn and the arrival of the apprentices to their work did not suffice him. It took him so long to hide all traces of his doings, to wash out the brushes, to rinse clean the paint pots that he had used, and on top of that to get the studio swept and dusted, that there was hardly time left him in which to indulge the itching of his fingers. Driven by necessity, he became a pilferer of candle ends, picking them from their sockets in the lanterns where the students carried them on dark nights. And now and then one of those would remember that, when last used, his lantern had had a candle in it, and would accuse Tiki-pu of having stolen it. "It is true," he would confess. "I was hungry. I have eaten it." The lie was so probable that he was believed easily. Down in the ragged linings of his coat, Tiki-pu could hear the candle ends rattling as the buffeting and chastisement fell upon him, and often he trembled lest his hoard should be discovered. But the truth of the matter never leaked out, and at night, as soon as he guessed that all the world outside was in bed, Tiki-pu would mount one of the candles on a wooden stand, and paint by the light of it, blinding himself over his task, until the dawn came and gave him better and cheaper light to work by. Tiki-pu quite hugged himself over the results, and he believed he was doing very well. If only Wio-wani was here to teach me, thought he, I would be in the way of becoming a great painter. The resolution came to him one night that Wio-wani should teach him. So he took a large piece of rice paper and strained it, and sitting down opposite Wio-wani's back door, he began painting. He had never set himself so big a task as this. By the dim, stumbling light of his candle, he strained his eyes, nearly blind, over the difficulties of it, and at last was almost driven to despair. How the trees stood row behind row, with air and sunlight between, and how the path went in and out, winding its way up to the little door in the palace wall, were mysteries that he could not fathom. He peered and dropped tears into his paint pots, but the secret of the mystery of such painting was far beyond him. The door in the palace wall opened, and out came a little old man and began walking down the pathway toward him. The soul of Tiki-pu gave a sharp leap in his grubby little body. "That must be Wio-wani himself and no other," cried his soul. Tiki-pu pulled off his cap and threw himself down on the floor with reverent grovelings. When he dared look up again, Wio-wani stood over him. Just within the edge of his canvas, he stood and reached out a hand. "Come along with me, Tiki-pu," said the Great One. "If you want to know how to paint, I will teach you." "Oh, Wio-wani, were you there all the while?" cried Tiki-pu ecstatically, leaping up and clutching with his smeary little hands the hand which the old man had extended to him. "I was there," said Wio-wani, "looking at you out of my little window. Come along in." Tiki-pu took a heave and swung himself into the picture, and fairly capered when he found his feet among the flowers of Wio-wani's beautiful garden. Wio-wani had turned and was ambling gently back to the door of his palace, beckoning to the small one to follow him. And there stood Tiki-pu, opening his mouth like a fish to all the wonders that surrounded him. "Celestiality, may I speak?" he said suddenly. "Speak," said Wio-wani. "What is it?" "The Emperor, was he not the very flower of fools not to follow when you told him?" "I cannot say," said Wio-wani, "but he certainly was no artist." Then he opened the door which he had so beautifully painted, and let Tiki-pu in. And outside the little candle end sat and guttered by itself until the wick fell overboard, and the flame kicked itself out, leaving the studio in darkness and solitude to wait for the growings of another dawn. It was a full day before Tiki-pu reappeared. He came running down the green path in great haste, jumped out of the frame onto the studio floor, and began tidying up his own messes of the night and the apprentices of the previous day. Only just in time did he have things ready by the hour his master and the others returned to work. All that day they kept scratching their head and could not think why. But Tiki-pu knew, for he was saying over to himself all the things that Wio-wani, the great painter, had been saying about them and their precious productions. As he ground their colors for them and washed their brushes and filled his famished little body with the breadcrumbs they threw away, little they guessed from what an immeasurable distance he looked down upon all of them, and had Wio-wani's word for it tickling his ear all the day long. Now before long, Tiki-pu's master noticed a change in him, and though he bullied him and thrashed him, and did all that a careful master should do, he could not get a change out of him. So in a short while he grew suspicious. What is this boy up to, he wondered. I have my eye on him all day, so it must be at night that he gets into mischief. It did not take Tiki-pu's master a night's watching to find out that something surreptitious was certainly going on. When it was dark, he took up his post outside the studio to see whether by any chance Tiki-pu had some way of getting out, and before long he saw a faint light showing through some windows. So he came and thrust his finger softly into one of the panes, and put his eye to the hole. There inside was a candle burning on a stand, and Tiki-pu squatting with paint pots and brush in front of Wio-wani's last masterpiece. What fine burglary is this, thought he. What serpent have I been harboring in my bosom? Is this beast of a grub of a boy thinking to make himself a painter and cut me out of my reputation and prosperity? For even at that distance he could perceive plainly that the work of this boy went head and shoulders beyond his or that of any painter then living. Presently Wio-wani opened his door and came down the path, as was his habit now each night, to call Tiki-pu to his lessons. He advanced to the front of the picture and beckoned for Tiki-pu to come in with him, and Tiki-pu's master grew clammy at the knees as he beheld Tiki-pu catch hold of Wio-wani's hand and jump into the picture, and skip up the green path by Wio-wani's side and through the little door that Wio-wani had painted so beautifully at the end of his palace. For a time, Tiki-pu's master stood glued to the spot with grief and horror. "Oh, you deadly little underling! Oh, you poisonous little caretaker! You parasite! You vampire! You fly in amber!" cried he. "Is this where you get your training? Is it there that you dare to go trespassing into a picture that I purchased for my own pleasure and profit, not for yours? Soon we will see who it really belongs to." He ripped out the paper of the largest window pane and pushed his way through into the studio. Then in great haste he took up paint pot and brush and sacrilegiously set himself to work upon Wio-wani's last masterpiece. In the place of the doorway by which Tiki-pu had entered, he painted a solid brick wall. Twice over he painted it and mortared every brick in its place. When he had quite finished it, he laughed and called, "Good night, Tiki-pu," and then went home to be quite happy. The next day all the apprentices were wondering what had become of Tiki-pu, but as the master himself said nothing, and as another boy came to act as color grinder and brush washer, the apprentices very soon forgot about him. In the studio, the master used to sit at work with his students all about him, his mind full of ease and contentment. Now and then he would throw a glance to the bricked-up wall of Wio-wani's palace and laugh to himself, thinking how well he had served out Tiki-pu for his treachery and presumption. One day, it was 5 years after the disappearance of Tiki-pu, he was giving his apprentices a lecture on the glories and beauties and the wonders of Wio-wani's painting, how nothing for color could excel or for mystery could equal it. To add point to his eloquence, he stood waving his hands before Wio-wani's last masterpiece, and all his students and apprentices sat round him and looked. Suddenly he stopped at mid-word and broke off in the full flight of his eloquence, as he saw something like a hand come and take down the top brick from the face of the paint which he had laid over the little door in the palace wall that Wio-wani had so beautifully painted. In another moment, there was no doubt about it. Brick by brick, the wall was being pulled down, in spite of its double thickness. The lecturer was altogether too dumbfounded and terrified to utter a word. He and all his apprentices stood round and stared, while the demolition of the wall proceeded. Before long, he recognized Wio-wani with his flowing white beard. It was his handiwork, this pulling down of the wall. He still had a brick in his hand when he stepped through the opening that he had made, and close after him stepped Tiki-pu. Tiki-pu had grown tall and strong. He was even handsome. But for all that, his old master recognized him and saw with an envious foreboding that under his arms he carried many rolls and stretchers and portfolios and other belongings of his craft. Clearly Tiki-pu was coming back into the world and was going to be a great painter. Down the garden path came Wio-wani, and Tiki-pu walked after him. Tiki-pu was so tall that his head stood well over Wio-wani's shoulders. The old man and the young man together made a handsome pair. How big Wio-wani grew as he walked down the avenues of his garden and into the foreground of his picture, and how big the brick in his hand, and oh, how angry he seemed. Wio-wani came right to the edge of the picture frame and held up the brick. "What did you do that for?" he asked. "I didn't," Tiki-pu's old master was beginning to reply, and the lie was still rolling on his tongue when the weight of the brickbat hurled by the stout arm of Wio-wani felled him. After that he never spoke again. That brick which he himself had painted became his own tombstone. Just inside the picture frame stood Tiki-pu, kissing the wonderful hands of Wio-wani, which had taught him all their skill. "Goodbye, Tiki-pu," said Wio-wani, embracing him tenderly. "Now I'm sending my second self into the world. When you are tired and want rest, come back to me. Old Wio-wani will take you in." Tiki-pu was sobbing, and the tears were running down his cheeks as he stepped out of Wio-wani's wonderful painted garden and stood once more upon earth. Turning, he saw the old man walking away along the path toward the little door under the palace wall. At the door, Wio-wani turned back and waved his hand for the last time. Tiki-pu stood watching him. Then the door opened and shut, and Wio-wani was gone. Softly as a flower, the picture seemed to have folded its leaves over him. Tiki-pu leaned a wet face against the picture and kissed the door to the palace wall, which Wio-wani had painted so beautifully. "Oh, Wio-wani, dear master," he cried, "are you there?" He waited and called again, but no voice answered him.